In 2002, a stuffed rabbit was found inside a dead man's trunk. On its ear, stitched in faded red thread, was a name no one had seen in 9 years. That name was Molly. The man who found it wasn't a cop or a detective. He was a collector of old furniture, a man named George who liked the smell of aged wood and forgotten things. He'd bought the heavy steamer trunk at an estate sale on a Saturday morning. The house belonged to a retired police officer who had passed away alone. No family came to claim his things, so it all went up for auction. George paid $50 for the trunk, thinking it would look nice at the foot of his bed. When he got it home, he noticed the bottom felt too thick, too heavy. He ran his hand along the inside lining and felt a slight give, a seam that wasn't supposed to be there. With a butter knife and a bit of patience, he pried up the false bottom. Underneath, it was empty, except for the rabbit. It was a simple, well-loved toy, with one button eye missing and its white fur worn down to the cloth in patches. But it was the name on the ear that made George's breath catch in his throat. Molly. He remembered the posters, the news reports from 1993. A 6-year-old girl who had vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night. The whole town had searched for weeks. Her parents, Sarah and Tom, had given desperate, tearful interviews, begging for any information. Then, nothing. The case went cold, buried under 9 years of silence and grief. George stared at the rabbit, the silence of his own house suddenly feeling heavy, suffocating. He called the police. Within the hour, 2 detectives were standing in his living room. One was older, tired-looking. The other was younger, with a sharp, focused energy. The younger one, Detective Evans, picked up the rabbit with a gloved hand. He turned it over and over, his eyes fixed on the name. He looked at George. "Did you know the man who owned this trunk?" he asked. "Arthur Miller?" George shook his head. "No, never met him. Just saw the notice for the sale." Evans put the rabbit in an evidence bag. The drive to Sarah and Tom's house was quiet. The older detective drove while Evans stared out the window, the bagged rabbit resting on the seat beside him. 9 years. A lifetime for a child. He'd been a rookie back then, just starting out, and he remembered the feeling in the town. A shadow had fallen over everything. Now, that shadow had a name again. Sarah answered the door. She looked older than her years, her face etched with a permanent, quiet sorrow. Tom stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, a silent pillar of support. They had never moved. They lived in the same house, a museum of a life that had stopped in 1993. Molly's room was untouched. Her drawings were still taped to the refrigerator. Evans felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to rip open a wound that had never truly healed. "Mrs. Clark," he started, his voice gentle. "We found something. We need you to look at it." He held up the evidence bag. Sarah's eyes, which had been vacant for so long, suddenly focused. A flicker of something, not hope, but a terrible, sharp recognition, passed over her face. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers pressing against the plastic. She didn't need to touch the worn fur. She didn't need to see the missing button eye. She just stared at the messy, childish stitches on the ear. The red thread she had used herself, teaching Molly how to spell her own name. Her voice was a whisper, a sound that carried 9 years of pain. "That's Barnaby," she said. "That's her Barnaby." Tom's hand tightened on her shoulder, his own face crumbling. Evans watched them, the past crashing into the present right there on their doorstep. The case wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. And it had all started with a dead man who was once sworn to protect them. The news that Molly's toy had been found spread through the small town like a quiet fire. For Sarah and Tom, it was a special kind of torment. The silence had been a vast, empty ocean. This new discovery was a single, cruel island in the middle of it. offering no rescue, only a clearer view of what they had lost. The police department officially reopened the case, with Detective Evans at the lead. His first task was to build a life for the man who had owned the trunk, Arthur Miller. The name was familiar to the older officers at the precinct. A good cop, they said. Quiet. Kept to himself. Retired 15 years ago after a solid career. No red flags, no complaints in his file. He was just a man who did his job and then disappeared into a quiet life. Evans didn't believe it. Quiet men had secrets. Evans spent days in the county records office and the police archives, piecing together Miller's history. He found that Miller had been a patrol officer for 20 years, then a detective for 10. He had a reputation for being meticulous, for closing cases, but he was also a loner, never married, no children. His parents were long dead. He was a ghost long before he died. Evans went to Miller's house. It had been sealed, but now it was his to explore. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and solitude. The house was neat, almost obsessively so. Books were stacked perfectly. Dishes were clean in the rack. It wasn't the home of a monster. It was the home of a man who craved order. He walked through the rooms, trying to feel something, some echo of the man who lived there. He found the empty space in the bedroom, where the trunk had been. He ran his hands along the floorboards looking for anything else hidden. He found nothing. But the trunk itself was a clue. Why the false bottom? Why hide a child's toy? It wasn't just stored away. It was concealed. It was a secret. He went back to the precinct and pulled the original file from Molly's disappearance. The details were sparse and heartbreaking. She was tucked into bed by her mother at 8:30. At 7 the next morning, her bed was empty. The window was locked from the inside. The door to her room was closed, just as they'd left it. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Evans read through the witness statements, the neighborhood canvass reports. Nothing. Then he found it, tucked away in Sarah's initial interview, a detail the original investigators had underlined and then dismissed. She told the officer that for a few weeks, Molly had been talking about a new friend, an imaginary friend. She called him Leo, and she said he lived in the walls. The original detective had written a note in the margin. Childhood fantasy? Normal for her age. But Evans couldn't shake it. A friend in the walls. He thought about Miller's meticulously ordered house, a place where everything was in its right place. He thought about the hidden compartment in the trunk. He thought about a man who lived his life in the shadows, unseen. What if the friend wasn't imaginary? What if Leo was real? Evans drove back to Sarah and Tom's house. He found them in the kitchen, sitting in silence. He felt like an intruder, a constant reminder of their pain. "I need to ask you about something from your first statement," he said, sitting down at their table. "About the friend Molly said she had." Sarah's eyes welled up. "Leo," she whispered. She said he was lonely. He would talk to her at night. She said he promised to show her his secret garden one day. Tom slammed his hand on the table, making them both jump. I told them to check the house, to check everything. They looked at me like I was crazy. They said kids have imaginary friends. They didn't listen." Evans looked from Tom's angry, grief-stricken face to Sarah's exhausted one. "I'm listening now," he said. He looked at the wall behind Sarah. The old plaster painted a cheerful yellow. He stood up and walked over to it, placing his palm flat against its surface. An old house, he thought, built a long time ago. Old houses have their own secrets. Evans needed to understand the house. He spent an afternoon at the town hall, digging through architectural records until he found the original blueprints for Sarah and Tom's home. It was built in 1922, A solid, standard design for its time. There were no secret passages marked, no hidden rooms, just a simple two-story family home. But the blueprints couldn't tell him about 90 years of renovations and changes. They couldn't tell him what might exist between the lines. He returned to the house that evening. Sarah and Tom sat on the living room couch, watching him with a mixture of hope and dread. He had asked for their permission to be there, to look closer, and they had agreed. Anything, Sarah had said. "We'll do anything." He started in Molly's room. It was exactly as she had left it. A pink canopy bed, shelves of dolls and storybooks, a small blue desk with a half-finished drawing on it. The air was thick with memory. Evans felt like he was trespassing on sacred ground. He remembered what Sarah had said. He would talk to her at night. He looked at the bed. The headboard was pushed up against the main wall, the one it shared with the master bedroom. He knelt down and knocked on the plaster. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded solid. He moved along the wall, knocking every few inches. Thud, thud. Then, something different. A hollow echo. Faint, but it was there. He knocked again, right behind where the headboard would be. Thump. It was a dead, empty sound. "My God," Sarah breathed from the doorway. Tom was right behind her, his face pale. "What is that?" Evans didn't answer. He pulled a utility knife from his pocket and scored a small square in the wallpaper. He peeled it back, revealing the old, cracked plaster underneath. He pressed his thumb against it, and a small piece crumbled away, falling into the darkness behind it. There was a space back there, a void. It wasn't just insulation or a gap between studs. It was a deliberate emptiness. Evans knew he couldn't go further without their permission, without a proper team. He turned to them. "I think we need to open this wall," he said. Tom nodded slowly, his anger from before replaced by a chilling stillness. Sarah just wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the hole in the wall as if it were a grave. The next day, Evans returned with a small construction crew. They carefully moved Molly's bed and furniture to the center of the room, covering everything in plastic sheets. It felt like a violation, dismantling a memory piece by piece. Tom and Sarah stood in the hallway, unable to watch but unable to leave. The crew chief used a small, precise saw to cut along the lines Evans had drawn. The sound of the blade tearing through plaster filled the silent house. Dust filled the air. When they pulled the large section of the wall away, everyone fell silent. It wasn't a crawl space filled with pipes and wires. It was a narrow passage, no more than 2 feet wide. It was dark and coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, but the floor was smooth wood, and the walls were planked. It was built to be used. It ran the length of the wall, a hidden corridor tucked inside the bones of the house. Detective Evans stepped forward, shining his flashlight into the oppressive dark. The beam cut through the thick air, landing on a small, 3-legged stool sitting directly behind where Molly's headboard had been. And next to the stool, glinting in the light, were small, discarded things. A bright orange crayon, a tarnished silver button, a single child-sized barrette with a plastic daisy on it. Sarah let out a strangled cry and collapsed against Tom. It was a listening post, a secret place where someone could sit for hours, their ear pressed to the plaster. A place where a man could whisper through the walls to a 6-year-old girl, pretending to be her friend. The friend in the walls was real. He had been right there, all along. The discovery of the passage changed everything. It was no longer a case about a missing child. It was a case about a predator who moved like a ghost through the very structure of his victims' lives. The hollow space in the wall was proof. The friend in the walls wasn't a fantasy. It was a terrifyingly real strategy. Evans now had a direct line connecting the hidden rabbit to Arthur Miller, and Arthur Miller to this hidden passage. But the how was still a mystery. How did Miller know about the passage? How many other houses had them? The answer, Evans suspected, lay in Miller's past. He went back to the archives, but this time he wasn't looking for Arthur Miller. He was looking for his father, William Miller. He found what he was looking for in the business archives of the local newspaper, in faded advertisements from the 1950s and 60s. William Miller, Sons, General Contractors, specializing in historic home renovation. The ads boasted of their skill in preserving the character of old homes. They had worked on dozens of houses in the historic district, the same neighborhood where Sarah and Tom lived, the same neighborhood where Arthur Miller had grown up. The pieces were locking into place. William Miller had built or renovated these homes. He must have built the passages. But why? Was he the original monster? Or was it just something he did? A strange signature left behind in his work. Evans couldn't know, but he was sure of one thing. Arthur Miller, as a boy, must have learned his father's secrets. He knew the hidden architecture of the town. This brought Evans to a darker, more disturbing thought. If Molly's house had a passage, how many others did? Was this how he operated? Was Molly his only victim? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He immediately assigned 2 junior detectives to a grim task: cross-reference every address William Miller's company had ever worked on with a list of every unsolved disappearance or strange incident in the town's history. It was a long shot, but he had to know. While they worked on that, Evans turned his attention back to Arthur Miller's own life. He had been a cop. He had access. He had authority. People trusted him. What had he done with that trust? Evans started pulling Miller's old case files, specifically the ones he worked on in the years leading up to his retirement. He was looking for a pattern, any sign of professional misconduct or unusual interest. For days, he found nothing, just solid, unremarkable police work. Then he found the file. It was from 1985, 8 years before Molly disappeared. The case of a 7-year-old boy named Daniel Peterson, vanished from his bedroom. No forced entry. Window locked from the inside. The case went cold. The similarities to Molly's case were uncanny. Evans felt his heart quicken. He checked the address. The Peterson family had lived just 4 blocks from Sarah and Tom, in a house built in 1928, a house that was almost certainly in William Miller's territory. Evans looked at the lead detective assigned to the Peterson case in 1985. The signature on the bottom of every report was clear, precise, and chilling. Detective Arthur Miller. He hadn't just known about the case. He had been in charge of it. He had been in the house. He had interviewed the grieving parents. He had been the one to tell them there were no leads, no hope. Had he been investigating himself? The idea was monstrous. Evans felt a surge of cold fury. He stood up and walked to the evidence board, where a picture of Arthur Miller's placid, unremarkable face was pinned. He stared into the dead man's eyes. "You were hiding in plain sight," he whispered. He grabbed his coat. He was going back to Miller's house. He had missed something. He had to have missed something. This time, he wouldn't be looking for a clue. He would be looking for a confession. Miller's house was no longer just the home of a dead man. It was the lair of a suspect. When Evans entered it this time, the neatness and order seemed sinister. A carefully constructed mask, hiding a lifetime of secrets. He bypassed the main floor and went straight to the basement. It was cool and damp, a single light bulb casting long shadows across the concrete floor. It was mostly used for storage. Old paint cans, a rusty lawnmower, stacks of newspapers tied with twine. Evans started at one end and worked his way across, tapping every inch of the stone and concrete walls. He was looking for the same thing he'd found at Molly's house: an inconsistency, a hollow sound, a seam that didn't belong. He spent over an hour, his knuckles raw, his frustration growing. Nothing. It was just a basement. He was about to give up when his light caught something on the far wall, behind an old, rickety shelving unit. It wasn't a seam in the concrete. It was the wall itself. The texture was different. The rest of the basement was rough, unfinished stone. This section was smooth, newer-looking plasterboard, painted to look like the rest of the wall. A patch job. A very good one. Evans pushed the shelves aside. They were heavy, loaded with jars of old screws and bolts. Behind them, the false wall was obvious. There was a faint outline of a door with no handle. He used a crowbar from his car to pry it open. The wood splintered, and the door swung inward into darkness. The air that rolled out was different. Not just musty. It smelled of dry paper and cedar. Evans shone his flashlight inside. It was a small, hidden room, no bigger than a closet. But it wasn't a closet. It was a workshop. There was a small workbench against one wall, with delicate tools laid out in perfect order. And on the floor, stacked neatly against the other wall, were a series of wooden boxes. They were beautifully made, like miniature hope chests. There were 5 of them. Each box had a small brass plaque on the front. Evans knelt, his light shaking slightly in his hand. He read the name on the first plaque, Daniel P. 1985. His blood ran cold. He moved the light to the next box, Molly C. 1993. He felt a wave of nausea. This was it. This was the proof. This was Miller's trophy room. He stared at the boxes, his mind racing with horrific possibilities. What was inside them? He reached out a hand, then pulled it back. This was a crime scene. He needed to call it in, but he had to know. He couldn't wait. He chose the box with Molly's name on it. His hands were trembling as he lifted the heavy lid. He expected the worst. Something gruesome. Something that would confirm Miller as the monster he imagined. But what he saw was somehow more intimate and more heartbreaking. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a collection of small, innocent things. A pink hair ribbon, tied in a perfect bow. A single white sock, folded neatly. A drawing, done in crayon on lined school paper. It showed a stick-figure family, a mommy, a daddy, and a little girl with bright yellow hair, all holding hands under a smiling sun. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, it said, "My family." These were Molly's things, souvenirs of a stolen life. Then Evans saw the book. It was a small, leather-bound journal, tucked in the corner of the box. It wasn't a child's diary. The handwriting inside was small, cramped, and precise. He opened it to the first page. The entry was dated October 5th, 1993, just days before Molly disappeared. The first sentence made the air leave his lungs. "She called me Leo today," it read. "She thinks I live in the wall. Maybe I do." He wasn't just looking at trophies. He was looking at a confession. It was Arthur Miller's diary. Evans sat on the cold concrete floor of the hidden room, the diary open in his lap. He read for hours, the single beam of his flashlight illuminating the cramped, spidery handwriting. The world outside, the police force, the grieving parents, the 9 years of silence, all of it faded away. There was only the quiet, chilling voice of Arthur Miller on the page. The diary wasn't the ranting of a madman. It was worse. It was lucid, methodical, and deeply, tragically lonely. It began in his childhood. He wrote of his father, William, a cold and demanding man who was a master of his craft but a stranger to his own son. William Miller was obsessed with perfection, with secrets. He built the passages in the houses he worked on not for any sinister purpose, but as a mark of his own cleverness, a secret signature that only he knew. He showed them to his son, Arthur, not as a gift, but as a lesson in seeing what others couldn't. For young Arthur, a solitary and ignored child, those passages became a refuge. They were his kingdom. He could move through the neighborhood unseen, a silent observer in the lives of other families. He would watch them through tiny peepholes he drilled, watching parents read bedtime stories, watching families eat dinner together. He wasn't a monster then. He was just a lonely boy, looking for the warmth he never had in his own home. The diary then jumped forward to 1985. Arthur was a detective now, a man respected for his quiet competence. But the loneliness had never left him. It had curdled inside him. One day, on a routine call, he was inside a house his father had renovated decades ago. He saw the subtle signs he had been trained to recognize. He found the entrance to the passage, and inside, he started listening. He heard a little boy, Daniel, crying in his room night after night. He heard the parents fighting. He convinced himself that Daniel was as lonely as he had been, so he started talking to him through the wall. He became his secret friend. He didn't see it as a crime. In his warped mind, he was offering a kindness, a rescue. The diary entries described how he groomed the boy, earning his trust, promising him a better place, a secret garden where he would never be lonely again. Then, one night, he took him. The case landed on his own desk. He performed the investigation with his usual diligence, all the while knowing it would lead nowhere. He had committed the perfect crime. He had investigated himself and found himself innocent. Years passed. The guilt, the diary said, was a dull, quiet ache. He retired. He thought he could leave that part of himself behind. But the loneliness was a constant companion. In 1993, he found himself walking through his old neighborhood and saw Molly playing in her front yard. He saw her parents, Sarah and Tom, and in them he saw the same imagined neglect, the same loneliness he thought he saw everywhere. The cycle began again. He found the passage in their house. He became Leo, the friend in the walls. He filled his diary with every detail of their conversations. He wrote down her favorite color, her favorite story, the name of her stuffed rabbit. He was meticulously building a profile, not as a predator, but in his mind, as a savior. He was going to rescue her from a life he believed was unhappy. The final entries were a detailed plan. He would take her to a special place he had prepared, a property he owned, far out in the country. He called it his garden. He would take her there, where she could be safe and happy, away from the world that he believed couldn't understand her. He saw himself not as a kidnapper, but as a guardian angel, a twisted, broken one. The last entry was dated the night Molly disappeared. "Tonight, she will come with me," it read. "I told her about the garden. She is not afraid. We will be friends forever." Evans closed the diary. The air in the small room was thick and suffocating. Miller wasn't a simple monster driven by hate. He was something far more complex and disturbing, a man so broken by his own loneliness that he spent his life stealing children to try and fix himself. He had the what, the how, and the why. Now, there was only one thing left to find: the garden. The address was in the diary. A small plot of land 30 miles north of the city, purchased by Miller under a shell corporation a year before Daniel Peterson disappeared. Evans didn't wait for backup. He drove himself, the diary on the passenger seat beside him, its terrible words seeming to fill the car. He left the neat suburbs behind, the roads growing narrower and more cracked as he headed into the countryside. He turned onto a dirt road, overgrown with weeds, the car bumping and rattling over the uneven ground. The road ended at a rusty gate, held shut with a thick chain. Evans cut it with bolt cutters. Beyond the gate was a small, dilapidated cottage, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, and behind it, a large, walled garden. The wall was old stone, covered in ivy. It looked ancient, but Evans knew Miller had probably built it himself, another one of his meticulous, secret constructions. The garden inside was a wreck. It had been unattended for years. Weeds choked everything. What might have once been flower beds were now just tangles of thorns and dead leaves. A stone bird bath lay on its side, cracked in two. This was the paradise Miller had promised? This desolate, forgotten place. Evans walked through the overgrown paths, his boots crunching on dead twigs. He was looking for a sign, any sign. The diary had been vague about what happened after he brought the children here. It only spoke of them being at peace in the garden. He scanned the perimeter, the crumbling walls, the gnarled leafless trees. Then he saw it. In the far corner of the garden, under the shade of a large dead oak tree, the ground was different. It was flatter, less overrun with weeds. There were two small rectangular patches where the earth seemed slightly sunken. Evans felt a profound, weary sadness wash over him. He didn't need a shovel to know what was under the ground. He knelt, the damp earth soaking through the knee of his pants. He reached out and brushed away some leaves from one of the patches. Underneath, almost completely hidden by dirt and time, was a small, flat stone. He cleared it off. There were letters carved into it, crude and uneven, like a child had done it. Daniel, my friend. He moved to the second patch. He found another stone, just like the first. This one said, Molly, my friend. This was the end of the line. This was the secret garden. There was no rescue. There was no escape. Just two lonely graves in a forgotten corner of the world. Miller hadn't saved them. He had buried them. Evans stood up and looked around the decaying garden. He imagined Miller, years ago, bringing the children here. He imagined their confusion, their fear. He imagined Miller, in his twisted mind, believing he was doing the right thing, giving them a final, quiet place to rest. It was an act of profound, selfish cruelty disguised as love. He pulled out his phone. The signal was weak, but it was there. He made the call. He kept his voice steady, professional. I found them, he said. He didn't need to say anything more. They would know. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with understanding. As he waited for the forensics team to arrive, Evans walked back to the cottage. He pried open one of the boarded-up windows and climbed inside. It was one room, bare except for a simple cot, a small table, and a chair. On the table were two objects: a child's drawing of a boat on a blue sea, and a small, worn book of fairy tales, left open to a page about a secret, magical garden. Miller had lived with his ghosts, right next to where he buried them. The days that followed were a blur of official procedures. The forensics team confirmed what Evans already knew. The remains of Daniel Peterson and Molly Clark were recovered from the garden. The town, which had been rocked by the discovery of the rabbit, was now silenced by the final, brutal truth. The story of Arthur Miller, the quiet cop who was a secret monster, was on every news channel. He was dissected and analyzed, a puzzle of a man nobody had ever truly known. But for Evans, the case wasn't about the headlines. It was about Sarah and Tom. He had to be the one to tell them. He drove to their house, the same house where he had first seen the hope and terror in their eyes. He sat with them in their living room, the untouched relics of Molly's life all around them, and he told them everything. He told them about the passages, about Daniel, about the workshop in the basement. He told them about the diary, about Miller's twisted loneliness. And then, as gently as he could, he told them about the garden. Sarah didn't cry. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of stone. The 9 years of not knowing had been a special kind of hell. This, the knowing, was a different one. It was quieter, heavier. It was the end. Tom stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where his daughter had once played. "All that time," he said, his voice thick, "he was one of them. He was supposed to protect us." There was nothing Evans could say to that. There were no words that could fix what had been broken. A few weeks later, after all the legal formalities were over, Evans went to see them one last time. He brought with him a small evidence box. Inside was the stuffed rabbit, Barnaby. It had been cleaned and processed, but it was still the same worn, well-loved toy. "I thought you should have this," he said, handing the box to Sarah. She opened it and lifted the rabbit out. She held it to her chest, her eyes closing. For the first time since Evans had met her, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, not entirely. It was a tear of release, the end of a long, impossible journey. She held the rabbit that her daughter had held on her last night. It was the only piece of that night she would ever have back. Later, Tom walked Evans to the door. "The wall," Tom said, looking toward Molly's room. "We're going to fix it, but we're not going to seal it up." Evans looked at him, confused. "We're going to turn it into a memory box," Tom continued, his voice finding a sliver of strength. "Put her pictures in there, her drawings, so she's not a ghost in the wall anymore. She's just part of the house. Part of us." It was a strange, beautiful, and heartbreaking way to reclaim the space that had been violated, to turn a place of terror into a place of remembrance. Evans nodded, understanding completely. As he drove away, he looked back at the house. It was just a house on a quiet street, but for him, it would always be a reminder of the secrets that can live inside walls and inside people. The case was closed, but the story would never really be over. It would live on in the quiet grief of two parents, in the memory of a town that had lost its innocence, and in a stuffed rabbit that had been hidden in the dark for 9 years, waiting to tell its story. The media storm eventually passed. The name Arthur Miller faded from the news, replaced by other tragedies, other mysteries. The town settled back into its quiet rhythm, but a scar remained. People looked at their old houses differently now. They listened more closely to the silence at night. For Sarah and Tom, life found a new, quieter shape. The initial, crushing weight of the truth slowly transformed into a manageable sadness. It was a part of them now, like a phantom limb, an ache that would always be there, but one they could learn to live with. They followed through on their plan. They hired a carpenter, a kind man with gentle eyes, to help them with the wall in Molly's room. They didn't just patch the hole. They built a shallow, glass-fronted case into the space where the passage had been. It was beautifully lit from within, a warm, soft glow that filled the room. Inside, they placed Molly's things. Her drawing of the family under the smiling sun, the pink hair ribbon, the single white sock. They added photos of her laughing on a swing, of her covered in birthday cake frosting, of her asleep in her father's arms. They even put the little plastic daisy barrette that Evans had found in the passage inside the case. They turned the place where a monster had lurked into a shrine. It was their way of taking back the narrative, of saying that this space, this house, this memory belonged to them, not to him. One evening, months later, Sarah was standing in the doorway of Molly's room, just looking at the warm glow from the wall. Tom came and stood beside her, putting his arm around her shoulder. It was so different from how they had stood there that day. The police cut the wall open. The terror was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet melancholy. "Do you think she was scared?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was a question that had haunted her for months. Tom was silent for a long moment. He thought about the diary, about Miller's description of a little girl who trusted her friend. "No," he said finally, his voice full of a conviction he willed himself to feel. "I think she thought she was going on an adventure, to a secret garden. I don't think she was scared until the very end. It was a small comfort, a story they could tell themselves. And maybe it was true. In the twisted logic of Arthur Miller's world, he wouldn't have wanted her to be afraid. That would have ruined his own fantasy. Sarah leaned her head on Tom's shoulder. She was holding Barnaby, the stuffed rabbit. Its fur was worn, its one eye staring blankly ahead. It had been there for all of it. It had been in the trunk, a silent witness in a dead man's house. Now it was back where it belonged. They didn't get rid of Molly's things. They didn't turn her room into an office or a guest room. They kept it as it was, but it was no longer a place of frozen grief. The memory box in the wall made it a living memorial, a testament not to how she was lost, but to how she had lived. The case files for Molly Clark and Daniel Peterson were officially closed, marked solved. For Detective Evans, it was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like an ending, sad and necessary. He had given two families the truth, but he couldn't give them back what they had lost. Sometimes he would drive through that old neighborhood on his way home from work. He would pass Sarah and Tom's house and see the soft light from Molly's window, a quiet beacon in the dark. It was a reminder that the deepest wounds never fully disappear. They just become part of the story, forever changing the shape of the lives they touch. Life for Sarah and Tom became a series of small, quiet moments. The sharp edges of their grief had been worn down by time and the terrible finality of the truth. There were no more false hopes, no more frantic searches of crowds for a face that might be hers. There was only before and after. They found solace in simple routines, tending the small garden in their backyard, reading books on the porch, taking long walks in the evening. They rarely spoke of Molly, but her presence was a constant, gentle hum beneath the surface of their lives. The memory box in the wall became a focal point. Sometimes Sarah would stand before it and quietly tell Molly about her day. Tom would sometimes just rest his hand on the glass, a silent communion. It was how they kept her close. One afternoon, about a year after the case was closed, a car pulled up in front of their house. It was Detective Evans. They hadn't seen him since he had returned the rabbit. Sarah invited him in for coffee. He looked tired, older than he had a year ago. The case had left its mark on him, too. He sat at their kitchen table, the same table where he had first asked them about the friend in the walls. He told them he was being transferred, a promotion to a larger city. This was his last week. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said, his voice sincere. "We're okay," Tom said, and for the first time, it felt true. "As okay as we can be." "That box you put in her room," Evans said, looking towards the hallway. "I think about that a lot. It was a good thing to do." "It was the only thing to do," Sarah replied softly. Before he left, Evans handed them a small, sealed envelope. "I wasn't sure if I should give you this," he said. "It's from the evidence files. It was in Miller's workshop. I thought you should be the ones to decide what to do with it." After he was gone, Sarah and Tom sat at the table and looked at the envelope. With trembling hands, Tom opened it. Inside was the small, leather-bound diary, Arthur Miller's confession, his story. They looked at each other. They had a choice. They could read it, immerse themselves in the mind of the man who destroyed their world, or they could let him remain a faceless monster, his motives and his pain forever a mystery. Tom picked up the diary. He walked to the fireplace, where a small fire was burning against the afternoon chill. He looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She nodded, a single, decisive movement. Without a word, Tom tossed the book into the flames. They watched as the leather curled and blackened, the pages catching fire, turning the cramped, hateful words into ash. They didn't need to understand his darkness. They didn't need to know his pain. All they needed to know was their daughter, her life, her light, was what mattered. The rest was just noise. As the last page turned to smoke and drifted up the chimney, a sense of peace settled over the room. It wasn't a happy ending. There could never be one. But it was a form of closure. They had taken back the story. They had honored their daughter's memory, and they had erased the voice of the man who took her. They were left with their love for her, a love that was stronger than any wall, stronger than any secret, and stronger than death itself. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.